True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Christa Worthington was a Vassar grad from a prominent family living on her own on Cape Cod. She had left behind her career as a fashion writer for a simpler life, having a daughter on her own and raising her on the Cape. But then in January of 2002, 46-year-old Christa was found stabbed to death in the kitchen of her cottage. Her toddler daughter was unharmed, clinging to her mother's bloodied body. Join us at the quiet end for The Burden of Bias. After Christa's murder, suspicions pointed towards several local men she'd known. But then in 2005, investigators arrested Christopher McCowen, a 34-year-old African-American garbage man. So according to police, McCowen gave inconsistent stories, and he would be convicted in a trial that was filled with conflicting testimony. But in January of 2008, a hearing was held to determine whether racism was a factor in the jury's decision to convict McCowen. 3 jury members testified that fellow jurors made racist remarks during deliberations, raising questions about whether his trial was fair and unbiased. Then since then, there have been 2 distinct sides to this story. McCowen's attorneys work to get him a new trial, and prosecutors insist that the right man was convicted. So lots to talk about here. What have we got for a beer?
Well, I got a beer that's brewed on Nantucket, which is close to Cape Cod. It's called Grey Lady from Cisco Brewing. It's a wheat beer. So it's a hazy pale gold color, small white head, pleasant citrus aroma, also some hay. Taste is lemony, little malt, sweet malt. And then the beer just kind of stops. It doesn't do anything more. So it's pretty bland, not my favorite wit. So I'm not sure how soon before I try this again.
Okay, so not a rave review. Although I'd say we're really not wit fans generally.
No.
It's not your favorite beer.
Oh, definitely not.
No.
So
okay.
there's that bias in there.
Right, but it's a hot summer day and I'm not picky, so let's open it up.
You got it.
Okay, why don't you join me down here at the quiet end and start us out? I just really feel like there's a lot to talk about, and I think we might have different opinions on some things, so that'll make it interesting.
We possibly could.
We could.
So it's Sunday, January 6th, 2002. The day was bleak, which is the usual weather for the Cape in the winter. Just outside of the kitchen of Christa's small home at 50 Depot Road, her green Ford Escort was parked at the top of her driveway. Signs of her 2.5-year-old daughter Ava were there, including a plastic little Tykes car. But if you looked more closely, you would see that something was off. On the flagstone walkway, there was a stray barrette. Then there was a pair of eyeglasses on the ground near the Escort's driver's side door. Under the front tire, there was a stray wool sock. Its mate was several feet away, lying in a flower bed. South of the house, toward a patch of woods, a set of keys lay on the ground as if someone had tossed them there. The interior of Christa's home was cluttered and messy, but this was the norm for this household. The back door led into her tiny kitchen, where Ava's toys were scattered about. The table was covered with newspapers and mail. Dirty dishes filled the sink. The stove had food-crusted pans left on top of it. So it was apparent that housekeeping was not Christa's highest priority. She was, after all, a writer and an artist at heart.
Sure. So the kitchen opened into the living room, and there were 2 doors, one leading to Christa's home office/study and the other to the bathroom. In her study, there was a desk lamp on, and this was just as messy as the kitchen. There were cardboard file boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, piles of magazines, plastic bins, and other loose papers. Her laptop was on, but it had been disconnected from the internet. So the house was simple, but the property was pretty impressive. It had a beautiful view of the salt marsh leading to Pamet Harbor, then the bay and Provincetown, with the Pilgrim Monument visible in the distance. Paintings by Christa's mother, Gloria Worthington, accented the walls. In the living room, 2 couches, a coffee table, a Christmas tree, and Christa's childhood piano made this space especially cramped. The couches were covered with clothing, coats, and books, and on the far side of the living room, the front door was locked. And actually, it probably hadn't been used in years. The kitchen entry was closer to the driveway turnaround where everyone parked, and the door to the bedroom was kitty-corner to the locked front door, and that was shut. So 2.5-year-old Ava navigated through the familiar surroundings of her home with ease that morning. She turned on the TV to watch her favorite video, but she wasn't able to figure out how to get the VCR tape into the machine. She tried putting it in end first, sideways, and upside down. And when she gave up, she was likely wondering when her mother was going to wake up and make her breakfast. Despite the mess, like you mentioned, Dick, the house was pretty much in its usual condition, but Ava's mother was lying on the floor in the hallway, naked from the chest down. Her head leaned toward her right shoulder, and blood had pooled on the floor below her swollen mouth. On her exposed stomach, there were tiny red handprints, Ava's. Ava walked back toward the kitchen and tugged at her mother, trying to rouse her. She had to be hungry and needed attention. She'd never gone this long without supervision, of course. So earlier, Ava had tried to clean her mother as her mother often cleaned her, using a cloth mitt to wipe up the blood. In the kitchen, she poured herself a bowl of Cheerios. She added milk to the bowl, leaving bloodstains on the glass bottle of organic milk that her mom always bought. Her hands were covered in blood. It was beneath her fingernails and on her hair. So she did eat a little, but her attention wandered, and hours passed, and Ava was alone with her mother's dead body. She had to be very confused and afraid. So it was late afternoon when Ava retrieved a bottle of apple juice from the refrigerator. She put it down on the floor next to her mother, then curled up beside her. Her mother had said she would have to stop nursing soon, but Ava gave up on the juice, and she went for the comfort of her mother's breast.
Meanwhile, Robert Arnold, a man in his late 70s, had gone to pick up his 44-year-old son Tim in nearby Wellfleet. Since his brain surgery 7 months earlier, Tim suffered from double vision and had balance and coordination problems, so he couldn't drive. He normally lived with his parents, but since mid-November he'd been house-sitting for friends in Wellfleet. His father was picking him up so Tim could do his laundry at his father's house. Tim and his father were watching a Patriots game while his clothes were in the dryer. Then Tim decided to call Christa Worthington, his ex-lover, who had remained a friend, to see if she still wanted to go out for Sunday night dinner. He had suggested it for Saturday, but she had declined. Tim had gotten the idea that she was going off Cape to see her dad, and when she didn't answer her phone, he thought she might be away. He left a message on her answering machine and went back to watching the game. Half-hour later, Robert Arnold was ready to drive Tim the 6 miles back to Wellfleet. Noticing a flashlight Tim had borrowed from Christa, he suggested they return it on the way. Robert grabbed the flashlight, Tim picked up the laundry basket, and they got into Robert's Ford Windstar. As Robert drove around Old Country Road and then cut back up to Depot Road, Tim wondered whether he should return the flashlight unannounced. Christa had chastised him before for just showing up at her place without calling ahead, and although he had left her a message, she hadn't agreed that he could come by. Seeing her could be difficult for him, since the romance had ended. He couldn't give up the idea, though, of them getting together as a family with little Ava, so he had hope.
Yes, he did. So Tim decided it would probably be best just to leave the flashlight on her back porch. As they slowed down to turn into Christa's driveway, it was Robert who first noticed 2 copies of the New York Times in blue plastic wrappers. Tim got out and picked up the papers. As they reached the left side of the house, Tim was surprised to see that Christa's car was there. So by now it was dusk, and there was one light coming from her study. So Tim walked around the house and went up the 3 steps to the kitchen landing. The wooden storm door was closed, but the inside door was open more than halfway. Looking inside, he saw Christa lying on the floor with Ava, and Ava appeared to be breastfeeding. So he thought, well, that's a weird place to be breastfeeding. And when he called out to let Christa know he was there, Ava popped up her head. Immediately, Ava ran to him as he entered the kitchen, and he sat the newspapers down on the table. Ava, who was normally a very talkative child, said nothing. She just clung to him. He took a few steps across the kitchen with her in his arms and looked down at Christa. He saw that she was naked from the chest down, with a bathrobe and a black fleece shirt around her shoulders. Her legs were splayed with her right knee bent and pointing at the ceiling. Her left leg was bent at the knee but flat on the ground. Her lips were swollen and blood had run down the side of her face onto the floor. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, and Tim looked into them. Then he reached down and touched her cheek. She was cold. So now in a panic he looked for the phone, which there should have been a cordless model around, but it wasn't in its cradle on the wall. So with Ava still in his arms, Tim stepped over Christa's body and into the living room. The TV was on, playing a children's show. The flashlight was still in his hand, so he put it down on a windowsill and turned off the TV. He stepped back over the body and stopped to check Christa's pulse, and of course there was nothing. The open bathroom door was just beyond her head, and inside he saw blood on the rim of the sink and a red-stained wash mitt on the floor underneath. Ava's little step stool was there too, so it appeared that she had tried to clean up her mother. So Tim carried Ava out to his father's Ford Windstar. His father had already turned the van around, so it pointed back toward the road. As Tim climbed inside, he said, "Christa is D-E-A-D," in a very shaky voice, not wanting to say the word dead in front of Ava. Then Tim went on, "I can't find a phone anywhere." Robert got out to go inside and look for the phone. He'd never been in Christa's house before and wasn't sure where to look in all the clutter. But he did see Christa. The right side of her face had obviously been beaten, and there were contusions covering her upper lip, nose, and forehead. There were smeared streaks of blood covering her chest and her abdomen. So he stepped over her body to check the living room. No phone. And he went back to the van. So the two men sat in the van, both having trouble deciding what to do next. Then Tim passed Ava to his father and went back inside. Again, he checked the kitchen and the living room. He opened the bedroom door and looked there too. He went back to the car, not noticing that Christa's cell phone was on the kitchen table, and the screen would show that she had punched in the number 9, so maybe she'd been trying to call 911 for help. But Tim felt he had no choice but to call 911 from his father's house, so he ran up the 100-yard path to his father's house, then dialed the emergency number. It was just before 4:30 p.m., and in a surprisingly stable voice, he told the dispatcher he thought Christa Worthington had fallen down her stairs. The Truro police switchboard logs recorded him saying, "I think she's dead."
Meanwhile, Christa's cousin, Jan Worthington, who was a member of Truro's rescue squad, was reading the newspaper at her home 2 miles away when her pager went off. The dispatcher announced, "You have a rescue call, 50 Depot Road, the Worthington residence, for an unconscious, unresponsive female." Jan immediately thought of her mother, Cindy, who had a pacemaker and lived on Depot Road. The address was wrong, but mistakes like that were sometimes made. So Jan drove as fast as she could, slowing down only when she pulled in front of her parents' house on the opposite side of Depot Road from Christa's. That was several hundred yards west. She turned back to Christa's driveway, and at the top of the hill, she saw Tim Arnold standing near his father's minivan. "It's Christa. I think she's dead," he told her. Jan ran up the steps and stopped at the landing. Through the kitchen door, she saw Christa on her back, wearing a green bathrobe bunched up around her shoulders. She turned back to Tim, screaming at him for an explanation. He repeated that maybe Christa had hit her head and fallen, but he didn't know. Jan again yelled at Tim, telling him to call the police. He said he couldn't find the phone, forgetting that he had already called 911.
Right, so halfway down the drive, Jan met with the ambulance. Paramedic Jeff Francis, responding from his nearby home, had followed it in his car. So Francis was the first official responder to step inside of the house, and the ambulance crew followed him. They flipped on the light switch near the kitchen table, and Francis noticed a pool of blood around Christa's head. He bent down to feel for a pulse on her neck. Christa had no pulse, she wasn't breathing, and he told the crew to clear an area so they could move her body. Her body was already cold and had already stiffened. So
rigor mortis had set in.
Absolutely. So 2 members of the ambulance crew later recalled seeing the green bathrobe around Christa's shoulders and 2 bloody handprints on her stomach. They used a brown blanket from the couch to cover her body, which they probably shouldn't have done. They also had a plastic yellow disposable blanket from the ambulance that they put on top of her body. So the deputy fire chief and 2 emergency medical technicians arrived, and the kitchen became crowded. Cars and trucks were parked end to end along the driveway, and Jan was still screaming. She finally stopped when her father arrived. So for the media, this case had everything: sex, money, violence, and a little girl found next to her mother's dead body. On Monday, January 7th, the morning after Christa's body was discovered, suspects were discussed. People who knew Christa would describe her as difficult, short-tempered, neurotic, and intelligent. They described her as a privileged Vassar graduate who had everything going her way until her murder. So in one story after another, they said that Christa spent her early 20s in Manhattan, dancing through the 1970s at Studio 54. Then she went to Paris, where she enjoyed the perks of working for Fairchild Publications, who were the publishers of the fashion journal Women's Wear Daily. So she'd spent some time with millionaires, fashion moguls, and celebrities. And then she'd moved on to freelance in London. After a string of affairs with various Brits and Americans, she moved back to New York, reclaiming the co-op that she owned in a turn-of-the-century building overlooking Gramercy Park. And then she wrote freelance for the New York Times and Elle. Eventually, she returned to her quiet house in Truro to live off the occasionally published pieces that she would do and her private income. So at 42, she became pregnant, and her baby, Ava, was fathered by a philandering ex-fisherman, and of course Ava was born out of wedlock. So there was kind of a lot of trash talking of Christa by people who were supposed to be her friends, which was interesting. So actually, after she did graduate from Vassar in 1977, Christa had worked as a paralegal for a while, and then worked as a writer and editor. For Christa, Ava's arrival was a miracle, but these reports were not Christa's reality at all. The celebrity life and the daughter were real, but the truth of Christa's life was far more complicated. Despite her advantages of wealth and education, she really wasn't a very happy woman. Christa struggled with decisions, and she would ask for advice from friends and relatives only to reject it. Friend Leila Levinson had seen a really masochistic side when the two were at Vassar together. Christa didn't seem able to have a functional, committed relationship with a man, and it caused a lot of turmoil in her life.
And Christa's grandmother, Tiny, was a major influence on her. Tiny's independence and disregard of other people's rules appealed to Christa. Once locals learned that Tony Jackett had fathered Christa's child, they recalled Tiny choosing local Portuguese fishermen as lovers. One of Tiny's most high-profile lovers was film star Paul Robeson, who was performing at Provincetown's West End Theater at the time. An avowed communist, Robeson was eventually forced into exile in the Soviet Union. He was a black man, and Tiny had always been Christa's role model.
So that's just something to think about when we talk about whether or not she did have a sexual relationship with her accused killer. So knowing Christa and her history, Levinson really had no issue believing that she would have a secret affair with her African-American garbage man. Ben Brantley, a New York Times drama critic who was Christa's supervisor at W, told police Christa had been attracted to difficult men. While in Europe, she'd had a long-term affair with an Englishman who was a very heavy drinker and who had tried to throw her out of a window at one point. So she was really kind of attracted to the chaos. And it might have been something she was outgrowing. She just never had a chance.
Well, that's conjecture.
Yes, it is. So after living in Paris in England, Christa had returned to the U.S., working for Elle for 2 years before going to freelance. And it was about then that she began her relationship with Gloria Vanderbilt's son, Stan Stokowski, who was the brother of CNN newscaster Anderson Cooper. When Stokowski broke up with her and started seeing another woman, Christa stalked him. So none of this is brought up by us to condemn her. I think it's just important to know that it would be possible for her to become involved with a black man and a man with a lower standing in society, like the eventual suspect, Chris McCowen. So the best potential lead to her murderer's identity was DNA found on Christa's body. DNA of an unknown male was found, which was consistent with someone having sexual relations. Investigators first looked at her immediate circle, focusing on her past boyfriends. While waiting for the crime lab to find a DNA match, they investigated neighbor and former boyfriend, Tim Arnold. So not only had he found her body, but his semen would be identified on the blanket thrown over Christa. And this didn't necessarily mean that he was her killer, because they had lived together for about 10 months in that house. But now Christa's relationship with Tim was over. But a lot of people thought Tim may have wanted to get back together. He denied to police that he had anything to do with their murder. Still, there were voicemails left around the time of her murder from Tim to Christa that were highly scrutinized by the police.
Hi, I think I'm going to head back over to Wellfleet. I'm not particularly comfortable here with this non-stop stream of stuff. So, not that it matters much, but hope you had a nice day. Bye. Hi. Just calling to check and see if you have plans for the night yet. Bye. Hi. Sunday morning around 8. Would you like to go have coffee? Are you around? I thought you would be up. I'm sorry if you're not. Hey, take care. Hi, Christa. What's up with the movie? Is that a problem? Did I call too early? And I get the feeling that this is one of those things where you say you'll call back and you're not going to. And I wondered what it's all about, if anything. So give me a call if you can, would you? Thanks. Well, I think you've made it very clear where you stand on the issue of friendship. So at this point, don't expect me to be around it. Hi, Chris. Just to clarify, if you wanted to call to try to arrange for time for me to see Ava, that would be fine. I'll see what I can do. But I don't really think that we should see each other, even briefly. Bye.
Over what length of time were those recordings?
That was all that weekend, I believe. Saturday to Sunday.
Because it almost couldn't seem to be making a case for him stalking her.
Yeah, I don't know about stalking, but I think he definitely was
He wasn't ready to
wanting
move
her.
on.
He was needy. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And got pretty angry towards the end.
Yeah.
Sounded like she was ghosting him. So I think he was probably, a decent suspect.
Yes, he
Yeah,
was.
because he was not happy. But, really kind of a passive guy, not any history of violence, so take it as you will.
Yeah. You're going to talk about this later. His brain surgery kind of precludes him as a suspect.
Yeah, kind of. Not totally, but yeah. So before Christa had moved to Truro, she'd gone to a fertility center to research artificial insemination, and then she'd written a piece for Harper's Bazaar on single motherhood. She'd gone to meetings of single mothers by choice, and she represented the group on the Lisa Gibbons TV show. She went to 2 gynecologists, and both of these doctors said she was premenopausal and might not be able to have a child. So, of course, she was upset and she cried over this, and then she had left the city to be with her mother, who had recently been diagnosed with cancer. So Christa then moved to Truro for the summer, settling into Tiny's beach shack there, which they called the Hut. And this was one of the 2 properties willed to Christa's father when his parents died. The other property, of course, was 50 Depot Road. So I just have to think it's nice in your life that you have family properties you can go to, I have to say.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it seems like a real advantage in life.
These are still pretty rudimentary places.
They are.
Yes, it's on the Cape, but it's not like they're living in mansions.
No, they're simple places, but the property is quite amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where the money lies.
But she didn't live a glamorous life there. I mean, she drove an Escort, right? So,
Yeah.
No, she wasn't living this wealthy life. It's just, if you grow up and you have problems in your life, it's nice to have a place you can go to.
Sure
where
is.
you don't have to pay rent or anything.
And this place is even pretty much off the beaten path, so you're not going to have a lot of folks coming to you.
Exactly. So the one-room shack they called the Hut sat on the sand less than 100 feet above the high water mark at Pamet Beach. That was adjacent to the town landing and the harbor master's office. So it was the kind of place where people spend a lot of their time out on the porch. It's not about having a great house, it's about the view. It's about being there.
Right.
Christa had barely unpacked when she began going over to chat with harbor master Warren Roderick. She usually had a complaint about someone leaving a boat on her property or something like that, and Roderick would indulge her. He also introduced her to his assistant, and that was Tony Jackett, who'd recently lost his fishing boat and was working part-time at the landing just to make ends meet. Jackett was 47, dark-skinned, with jet black hair. And if you look at pictures from that time, he was handsome. Later on when they interview him, maybe not so much. But Tony was married for 27 years, and he was the father of 6. Still, he was known as a ladies' man. I don't know how he managed that. I guess he had a very understanding wife.
Must have.
His relationship with Christa was kept secret for a very long time, though, and it continued for more than 2 years. Until she got pregnant, Christa's relatives knew nothing about the relationship, and it came as a surprise to Tony that he'd gotten her pregnant.
Why did he think she couldn't get pregnant?
Well, she was 40, so maybe,
40s, yeah.
I don't know what he thought.
There wasn't any discussion of birth control.
I don't think he was the kind of guy that really discussed that, right? So Tony was one of the investigators' primary suspects in the murder starting out. He was Provincetown's shellfish warden, Truro's assistant harbor master, and, of course, the father of Christa's child. He'd carried on with their secret long-term affair, but then he'd walked away when Christa told him she was pregnant and she planned to keep the baby. So according to friends, Christa kept hoping that Tony would become involved, but he never did. Instead, he hid the child from his wife for more than 2 years, which was no easy thing in a small place like Truro. So police knew he'd had other affairs before, and also during the time that he was seeing Christa.
Well, Truro being Truro, I'm sure everyone's affairs, everything was fodder for discussion.
Yeah, so it's really amazing that they were able to keep it a secret.
No kidding. So early on, detectives asked Tony to come into the Truro police station to expand on the statements he had made to locals. He didn't expect to take a polygraph, but he passed it anyway. Tony's wife Susan underwent the same procedure 11 days later on January 22nd. Susan had eventually learned about Ava and decided to keep her marriage together by trying to bring the child into the family. Christa had accepted the idea at first, but then had second thoughts, recognizing the financial and educational differences between them.
Yeah, so I don't know what you mean by that statement. That sounds a little snobbish.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, like they're a little bit lower class. She may have seen it that way, yes. So police knew that Susan was her husband's alibi, claiming she was with him most of that weekend of the murder. But she, too, passed the polygraph. And what police didn't realize was that Susan's attempts to get along hadn't been totally successful. Relations between Christa and Tony were actually quite strained, as Christa and her lawyer pushed him for child support and health insurance for Ava. Some believe that the Jackett's custody battle for Ava after Christa's murder was just an attempt to gain control of Christa's estate, which was valued at over $1.5 million, counting the real estate. So that's not hard to really imagine, because the Jackett's annual earnings were less than $40,000.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so if they took this girl in and got all that money, doesn't mean they wouldn't have been good to her or taking care of her, but there is that financial incentive for certain.
Oh, for sure.
So police didn't dismiss Tony Jackett as a suspect just out of hand, but by the end of January, other candidates had drawn more of their attention. And at the top of the list was Tim Arnold. Some locals doubted that Tim could have physically committed the act. He sometimes struggled just to pour himself a cup of coffee. Still, after interrogating him on January 6th, 9th, and 13th, and then again 1 year later on January 18th, 2003, police could not dismiss the idea that he was capable of Christa's murder. Their idea was that if Tim had picked up Ava and carried her through the house to his father's van outside, then he'd run the 100-yard path through the woods back to his father's house to call 911, maybe he wasn't so weak. A man in a state of strong emotion, charged with adrenaline, could also have managed the deadly knife thrust used the cordless handset to beat her, because the cordless phone was never found. But to point the finger at Tim Arnold, they did have to show how he got from Wellfleet, where he was house sitting, to Christa's house in Truro, which was 6 miles away. He could have hitchhiked or taken a taxi, but after 4 weeks of investigating, police found no one who had given Tim a ride.
Now, with just a description of his physical shortcomings, I don't think he could have done it physically.
Yeah, that's what some of the investigators thought, but then you have to think if he was in a rage, if she'd rejected him and he was really in a rage, how hard would it be?
Hard.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do.
Well, there's one thing I think we kind of disagree on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Point one.
Point one, because sure, he did have his problems, but he was, a good-sized man. I don't know how strong she was necessarily, but if he caught her off guard behind her and whacked her in the head or something, certainly.
Well, that stuff, sure, but how does he trying to get him to run through, carries the child out of the house, gives her to his father, runs 100 yards or more through the woods, back to his father's house to call 911, and then runs back?
Well, he did do that. That's a fact that he did that.
Well, they're saying he ran in both times.
Well, whether he ran or walked, he was capable. He did do that. We don't know how difficult it was.
Well, people have seen him moving around. He can't walk very well.
Well, I don't know. I think if he was able to carry that little girl and run down the street, then maybe he'd be able to murder her with his adrenaline pumping. I think it's definitely a possibility, although I do take your points. So police still weren't ruling out anyone, even including Tony's then son-in-law, Keith Amato, who'd taken an outside shower twice at Christa's house near the beach. Now, the thing about him was he was in the midst of a divorce from his wife, so was it possible that he had an affair with Christa? We don't know. But as police looked at those closest to Christa, their investigation included her father as well, Christopher Toppy Worthington. So that's a name of the New England elite, right? Toppy?
It's a good preppy name, isn't it?
It certainly is. And Toppy had a much younger girlfriend named Elizabeth Porter. Toppy, then 72 years old, was a Harvard-educated lawyer and a former prominent government official. His girlfriend, Elizabeth Porter, was 29 and a former sex worker and a heroin addict. So while in his early 60s, Toppy, a graduate of the exclusive Kent School, Harvard and Harvard Law, had abandoned his successful legal career as an assistant state attorney general and then private practitioner to become a bicycle courier for a Boston delivery service. So there has to be a story there.
Boy, it sure does.
Yeah.
That's quite a change.
It certainly is. Shortly before her murder, Christa told friends in New York and Truro that she was afraid her father was frittering away Ava's inheritance. Records from the Boston-based money management firm handling both Christa's and her father's accounts showed that he was making monthly withdrawals of $2,000 to $3,000, and these funds were wire transferred directly to his young girlfriend, Elizabeth Porter, again a heroin addict he'd met through an escort service. So he had bought her a computer, paid medical bills for treatment of her ulcers and other illnesses, and covered her rent for more than a year. So looking at records for 2001 alone, Toppy's withdrawals totaled $139,666.
Well, they'll go through that $1.5 million pretty quickly.
That's the thing, and Christa was worried about that.
Yeah, she'd been upset about Toppy's relationship with Porter. After his daughter's murder, Toppy's relationship with Porter made headlines in the media. Before talking to Porter about the case, police questioned Toppy. He was notified about his daughter's murder on the night her body was found, and he went to Christa's uncle John Worthington's house, where the rest of the Worthington family had gathered. This was about 9 p.m. on January 6, 2002.
Yeah, but one interesting thing is that he didn't go directly there. He went and ran some errands first, which made it very weird. You find out your daughter's been murdered, and you don't rush right out there.
And the first thing you do is go shop?
Yeah, I don't know if it was shopping, but I know he did some kind of errands that weren't necessary to do right then. So as Sergeant Burke was telling Toppy about what had happened to Christa, Toppy asked questions that really got investigators' attention. At one point, Toppy interrupted Burke to ask if his daughter was on her back and if there was a lot of blood with injury to the right side of her head. And police wanted to know how Toppy knew that Christa was on her back and that there were cuts and bruises on her face, including swelling on her right eye. But when Burke asked Toppy if anyone had told him about what had happened to Christa, He said no, he was just trying to figure out if the person who did it was right or left-handed. But what caught investigators' attention the most, of course, was Toppy's relationship with Elizabeth Porter. The day after Christa's body was found, they asked Toppy whether he was seeing anyone, and Toppy said he was, but he refused to give them her name, which was very weird. In Burke's report of their conversation, Toppy said his girlfriend had had trouble in the past, and that's why he didn't want to give them her name. But he told them that if they wanted it, I'm sure you'll find it. So that didn't make the police really happy with him.
No. Now, interestingly, Porter had been linked to another murder just a few years earlier. She had testified before a grand jury that she met a man named Dirk Greinader while working for an escort service in 1998. Greinader was a Massachusetts doctor who was sentenced to life in prison for killing his wife in 1999. The prosecution said that Greinader had killed his wife after she had become aware of his extramarital activities, which had included Porter. I think most of his activities were with sex workers.
Oh, Grinders?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny. We covered this case back in 2020. It's episode 297. And the longer we do this podcast, the more we see overlappings.
Yeah, we do.
We've been seeing that quite a bit lately because we're up to 8 years, over 8 years.
Yes.
So even though Toppy Worthington didn't give Porter's name to the police, it didn't take them long to find her.
Well, that's what he said.
Yeah, he was right about that. By January 9th, 2002, 3 days after Christa's body was found, investigators had their first interview with Porter. According to police reports, she told them that Toppy was her boyfriend and that she had met him while she worked for an escort service back in 1998. Police asked her if Toppy had been giving her money, and even though she was reluctant at first, she did eventually tell them that Toppy had been giving her a few $100s a week in spending money, as well as paying for her apartment and utilities. So pretty much supporting her and her habit. As news reports would later show, Porter's landlord was under a completely different impression of what the relationship between Toppy and Porter was. The landlord told ABC's Boston affiliate, WCVB-TV, at the time, that they thought Porter was Toppy's stepdaughter. So what's the age difference here? 40 years?
A little over 40 years.
Yeah, 39, 49, 15. Yeah? Wow. That's amazing. That's a big jump.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, you find someone who's paying for all this stuff, you latch onto him.
Yeah, he had issues.
Definitely.
Now, police eventually learned from Christa's friends in the days after her death that her father's relationship with Porter and the money he was spending on her had become a major issue for Christa. In interviews with police, Toppy said he was at his house asleep at the time when Christa was killed, which was sometime in the overnight hours of Friday, January 4th, 2002, and into the early morning hours of Saturday, January 5th, 2002. Porter told police that she was at her apartment alone then, but then police learned that she was actually with a former boyfriend of hers, another heroin addict, who had called in sick to work overnight that Friday into Saturday. So I think she's using Toppy, and she's really with this other addict.
It certainly seems that way.
Yes, and this was Eddie Hall. So when she was first interviewed by police, Porter said she hadn't seen Eddie Hall in several months. But police then learned that Hall had been living with Porter for the last year or so at the apartment Toppy was paying for. He said he had spent the night in the apartment with Porter, and police asked Hall and Porter in separate interviews what they would do if the money from Toppy ran out. Hall said that they would have to clean up and get jobs, while Porter told police she wasn't at all concerned about it. But police were trying to find out if Christa's attempts to prevent Porter from getting any more money from Toppy had maybe driven Hall and Porter to kill Christa.
Yeah, according to some people, Porter was slowly pecking away at Christa's inheritance. Sure sounds that way. Christa was watching her future share of Toppy's estate go bye-bye. It seemed like a motive for the father's girlfriend to kill Christa because Christa was trying to get in the way of the money Toppy was giving her. So in one police report, Hall told them that Porter had once said she wished Christa was dead, after Toppy had told her that Christa was upset with how much money he was spending on Porter, so he'd have to cut back. Hall added that after Christa's death, Porter said she felt bad for saying that. Police asked Hall if he had anything to do with Christa's death, and he said no. Hall said Porter couldn't have done it either, since she had been with him that weekend.
Yeah, so Toppy, Porter, and Hall all agreed to take polygraphs. Toppy and Porter failed their tests while Hall's results were inconclusive. The state trooper who administered Toppy's test wrote that Toppy was deceptive and showed significant responses to the question, "Did you plan with anyone to harm Christa?" Porter's report said she showed deception and significant responses to the questions, "Did you stab Christa in that house?" and "Did you plan with anyone to harm Christa?" When police came to speak with Porter about her polygraph test and told her she'd failed, Porter apparently became emotional and claimed that she was dope sick, and so her results were invalid. Porter told them that she would cooperate in any way to prove her innocence, and she offered to give hair samples, DNA samples, and even fingerprints. But there was one key piece of evidence that would clear Porter, Hall, Tim Arnold, and every other potential suspect police had focused on, and that would be DNA from an unknown male that was found inside and on Christa's body.
Investigators had found saliva and semen on Christa that matched one person, but at that point in the case they hadn't been able to identify him. So police had found Tim Arnold's DNA on a brown blanket that had been thrown over Christa's body the night she was found. But since Arnold had previously lived in the house with her, investigators didn't think it was significant.
Okay, so here's the thing. We know he lived with her, and that would be totally understandable. His DNA would be on the blanket.
Right.
And what people who think Chris McCowen was falsely convicted would say is, well, what would prevent her from having sex with this Chris McCowen, and then his DNA would be there? But there are a lot of factors, because people knew she was with Tim. He lived there.
Right.
Nobody ever saw her actually with Chris. So neither Arnold Hall nor Tony Jackett's DNA matched the saliva and semen sample that was found. Police had taken DNA samples from at least 25 people in the first year after Christa's murder. But of those 25, no one matched the DNA. To find out who had last had sex with Christa, police asked every male in the community to submit DNA samples. And by then it was early 2005, and investigators stood in front of businesses in the town of Truro and asked men to voluntarily give up their DNA. So it was this move that really pushed the case into the national spotlight. One of the places investigators stood outside of to collect DNA samples was the Truro post office. So there's no mail delivery in Truro, and people must come to the post office to pick up their mail. And the town's residents had mixed reactions to this DNA sweep. "It clearly circumvents my civil right to privacy," one resident said at the time. And he was actually so outraged by the idea, he called the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which then asked District Attorney Michael O'Keefe to stop collecting samples. The DNA sweep was also criticized for the possibility of flooding the state crime lab with DNA swabs and then causing a backlog of untested evidence. So what do you think of these sweeps?
Well, I think they have to be able to narrow it down to a reasonable number of suspects.
So you don't think you should just do a general sweep of the town?
No.
Because of people's rights?
There's that, but you're wasting time and efforts.
Well, I just know that you don't want to do 23andMe, so I thought maybe you thought privacy was an important thing. Because
that is.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily have to be a criminal to not want your DNA swabbed and tested, especially if you don't have trust for the authorities.
Right. But the difficulty with that is, particularly in a small town, if you're one of the people that decline to be tested, people look at you differently.
Exactly, right.
So,
yeah. Now, in April of 2005, 2 months after that DNA sweep, investigators met with the state crime lab to discuss how they should prioritize the samples for testing. But instead of sorting through the samples and deciding who to test first, investigators got a break. On April 7, 2005, more than 3 years after Christa's death, the state crime lab had gotten a DNA match for the semen found inside of Christa's vagina. So this match came from a DNA sample given to investigators more than a year earlier, and then within a week, police made an arrest.
33-year-old Christopher McCowen was in his bed on a Thursday evening in April 2005 when Massachusetts state police officers came to the house he was living in on Cape Cod and told him that he was going to the state police barracks. Police gave him some shoes, put him in handcuffs, walked him outside, and put him into the back of an unmarked police car. State police filmed him being led out of the house.
Yes, so McCowen's arrest was surprising. He'd never been mentioned publicly in the investigation before, and he was only one of a few black men in the community. So Christa, of course, was a wealthy white woman, which would make some question whether McCowen could even get a fair trial there. Chris McCowen was born in Oklahoma in March of 1972. His father, Roy McCowen, printed newspapers for a living in Tulsa, while his mother lived in Frederick, Oklahoma, about 200 miles away. Chris needed a lot of medical attention when he was young because he suffered from seizures. Roy McCowen said doctors suspected Chris may have fallen off the bed and hit his head as an infant, which then caused him to have the seizures. Chris's seizures made raising him difficult because he needed constant care, Roy said, and the children's hospital where he could receive treatment was 120 miles away from Frederick. So Chris actually ended up going to live with his paternal grandmother. Roy McCowen said Chris outgrew his seizures by the time he was 13 years old, but by third grade he'd been having academic difficulties. His IQ would be described as borderline. Chris was a large child who excelled at sports, especially football, but he started to fall behind, maybe as a result of the medication he'd been taking for his seizures. So what kind of medication do children get for seizures, and can it have an effect on their intelligence?
It can have an effect on their cognition, and so it would be difficult reading and memorizing stuff.
So give me the difference between intelligence and cognition.
Well, cognition is how you think, how you comprehend what's going on, and intelligence is just what you're born with.
Okay. So it could affect how he would function in school.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So Chris was placed in special education classes, which his father said really didn't help him. Then he ended up dropping out of high school by his senior year. He'd started getting into legal trouble as a teenager. His father said he'd been relocated to Key West, Florida by then, but Chris was still living in Oklahoma. And then Chris got into trouble for stealing checks from his grandmother and staying out all night. Chris eventually went to live with his father in Florida, but he continued to get into trouble, and he got a conviction for grand theft that put him in jail for about a year and a half in 1994. During his years in Florida, Chris's criminal record grew, including a stolen property conviction. His father said not long after his son got out of jail in 1995, Chris left Florida and moved to Cape Cod. Roy said he did it to be closer to an ex-girlfriend named Pamela McGuire. Chris and Pam had met in Florida, and they had a daughter together. After Chris got into trouble, Pam left Florida for Cape Cod, and that's where she was from originally. So Chris followed her up there after he got out of jail. Chris was in love with Pam, and he was happy when he got a job with a sanitation company on Cape Cod. So he made a living working as a garbage man for Cape Cod Disposal. His supervisor and a co-worker would say that McCowen had a good rapport with the residents along his route, and this would include Christa Worthington at 50 Depot Road.
By the time Chris McCowen began working at Cape Cod Disposal, he was no longer dating Pam McGuire, but he was involved with a woman named Kelly Tabor. McCowen and Tabor began dating in 1998, and they also had a daughter together, who was born in 2000. But this didn't stop McCowen from sleeping with other women. A co-worker told ABC News that Chris was juggling several women. Roy McCowen also said his son was a player. And according to Chris himself, he had several consensual relationships, and his flings with women even included some who were on his trash route. And one of the women Chris McCowen would say he hooked up with on his route was Christa Worthington. So he's admitting that he's had sex with her.
Well, they found his DNA in her vagina, so what other way do you get out of that? You just have to say it was consensual. So after police kept hitting dead ends in this murder investigation, they eventually did circle back around to McCowen. It was March 2004 when investigators decided that they would talk with McCowen a second time. Now, by then, they'd done an extensive background check on him, and it had really raised some red flags. They already knew about some of his past convictions, but they now saw several restraining orders that had been filed against him in domestic disputes. So the first restraining order was filed back in 1998 by Pam McGuire. In her affidavit, McGuire said she was afraid of McCowen because of what had happened in the past. She claimed he had pushed her against the refrigerator, intimidated her, and thrown a TV remote and coffee table at her. 1 year later, in 1999, an ex-girlfriend named Amy filed a restraining order against him, claiming he had shattered the window of her car. Then a woman named Lori Mayhood filed a restraining order against McCowen, which she would say stemmed from the night when her then 16-year-old daughter Katie ran away from home. Mayhood said Katie had become friendly with McCowen, who was 26 at the time, after the two had met at a local Dunkin' Donuts where she worked. One night, Mayhood said Katie ran away from home, and she ended up spending the night at McCowen's house, which of course worried her, so she called the police, who went searching for her. And they did find her the next day in McCowen's apartment. So after the police brought Katie home, Mayhood said they advised her to take Katie to the hospital, to have her examined, and have a rape kit tested to see if there'd been any sexual activity between them. And when the results came back, they were negative. So Mayhood said they knew there wasn't anything going on. So she went back to the police for advice, and they told her to get a restraining order to keep McCowen away from her daughter. Now, the daughter, Katie, claimed that the night she stayed with McCowen was just an innocent evening, and all they did was watch movies until 2 a.m. She said McCowen was very kind to her and was 100% a gentleman. She said he was caring, generous, very polite, and never seemed mean or rude. Mayhood said the restraining order was just a tool to keep her daughter away from him, but she also said she didn't think McCowen was violent nor capable of murder. Mayhood even said that McCowen let her daughter stay with him to keep her safe the night she ran away, because otherwise he knew she'd be out hitchhiking. She needed to be in a safe place, and his house was a safe place, Mayhood said. He didn't touch her, he didn't have sex with her, he simply picked her up and took her to his house for the night and kept her off the streets for the night. So, I'm skeptical. How do you feel? I mean, a 16-year-old girl spending the night with a 26-year-old man who's not even related to her?
I, too, am skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was innocent, but that worries me.
Yeah, it's a red flag.
It is, because a 16-year-old girl, if she has feelings for an older man, she'd cover for him.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm a little uneasy about that. So then in January 2004, 2 months before investigators came to talk to McCowen a second time about Christa's murder, McCowen had another restraining order filed against him. This one was from Kelly Tabor, his former girlfriend who he was dating at the time of Christa's death. In her affidavit, Tabor claimed that she and McCowen got into a fight one evening and that he threatened her, saying, "If you say one more word, I will snap your neck." So she called the police and McCowen was taken to jail. He was eventually sentenced to probation for making domestic violence-related threats. But like Lori Mayhood and her daughter, Katie, Tabor, too, said she regrets getting a restraining order against McCowen. She said she did not believe McCowen was violent nor capable of murder. Again, I'm skeptical because if someone says something like that to you in anger, it's scary. Mm-hmm. And why did they change their minds about it? I'm not sure. These could be people who have a history of being in violent relationships, so they're kind of have a high tolerance for that sort of thing.
I know.
I'm not sure. So District Attorney Michael O'Keefe announced Chris McCowen's arrest on April 15, 2005. There were questions about the delay, and O'Keefe told reporters that they couldn't process McCowen's DNA sample more quickly because of the backlog at the crime lab. Seated in a conference room at the police barracks, police read McCowen his Miranda rights and told him that he did have the option to waive these rights. That's according to them, of course. But he did agree and sign a waiver form, we know that. According to the police report, they also asked McCowen for consent to record their conversation, but he declined. Then there was this 6-hour-long interview that would play a big part in his eventual murder trial. There are no audio recordings or interrogation tapes of McCowen's interview with police after his arrest. So the roughly 6 hours police spent with him were just summarized in a 27-page report. McCowen's story, as it was told to police, began with him telling them that he didn't even know Christa Worthington. Then the report says detectives told McCowen they had DNA evidence from her body, and it was his. So in the report, it says that McCowen then stated, "It could have been me." Police said they asked McCowen what he meant by that, and McCowen said that he could have had sex with Christa, but he didn't remember because he was so drunk. I always feel like not remembering because you were so drunk is never a good excuse.
No, it's not a good way to defend yourself.
No, it really isn't.
So according to the report, McCowen told detectives that Fridays and Saturdays were his party nights, and that the weekend Christa was killed, he was with his friend Jeremy Frazier on Friday of that weekend, January 4th, 2002. They were at a local place called the Juice Bar, an underage club.
Yeah, so that's concerning too, because McCowen was 29 at this time.
McCowen remembered being drunk with his friend Jeremy Frazier at an open mic rap contest there that night.
Right, so maybe that's why he was there, but he seems a little old to be at an underage club.
Yeah, he was 29, as you said.
Yep.
So McCowen and Frazier broke away from the contest to visit McCowen's former girlfriend, Pam McGuire, and his daughter in Dennis, about 10 miles away. McCowen was the first to raise Frazier's name in connection with the case. The two had stayed at Pam McGuire's for about half an hour, then returned to the Juice Bar, where McCowen continued to drink Alizé, a strong cognac fruit concoction made famous by rappers such as Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. They'd purchased the Alizé at Windmill Liquors on the way to McGuire's. So I guess McGuire's gotten over her restraining order with him.
She did, yeah. The police report stated that McCowen said, "I don't remember having sex with this lady," as he tapped the DNA report in front of him. He said that Frazier had taken him home later that night and that they had drank to blackout, and that was the second time in his life that he'd done that. It's another thing that's kind of hard to believe. But McCowen was encouraged to try to recall even one small event from that weekend, anything that might trigger his memory. And after a few minutes, McCowen bowed his head and said, "Yeah, fine, I had sex with her." He said he couldn't remember clearly, though. "Anything could have happened, but I know I didn't kill her." He was so drunk he didn't remember how he got home, and when the detective reminded him that he'd earlier said that Frazier drove him home, McCowen said, "Well, that sounds about right." And remember, this is all in the police report, so we don't 100% know what he said.
Well, no, not 100%.
Not 100%, and then I would say if his cognition or intelligence were not great, it'd be easy to pull the wool over his eyes with this report and have him sign it, without him really going over it detail by detail. But McCowen would later say that he didn't say these things at all, and of course there wasn't the recording of it. It was questionable, too, if he should have been interviewed at that time at all, because he was under the influence of Percocet, cocaine, and marijuana. Police found burnt joints in his house, and he told them he'd taken 2 Percocet for knee pain on the afternoon of his arrest. McCowen's trial began on Monday, October 16th, 2006. Christa's murder had been in the news for a very long time by then. And although the first day of trial was devoted to jury selection, the courthouse parking lot was filled with network TV trucks with dish antennas. And inside the courthouse, several dozen reporters were crammed into the balcony of the main courtroom.
McCowen's defense attorney, Robert George, moved for a change in venue, supporting his motion with a box of press clippings with headlines like, "Black Trash Hauler Ruins Beautiful White Family."
I can't believe that was a real headline. Can you?
Yeah.
Ruins Beautiful White Family?
Black murderer apprehended in fashion writer slaying.
Yeah. I mean, you have to say that's racist for sure.
Yeah.
It's blatantly racist.
The experienced defense lawyer didn't expect the judge to hand off the high-profile case, but he wanted the motion on record. The murder had gone unsolved for 39 months, and during that time the public had been exposed to hundreds of stories in the media whose underlying message was, "White beauty ravaged by a black beast."
That's really not an exaggeration.
Nope. George said it would be impossible for McCowen to get a fair trial.
Right. So George was his defense attorney, who was kind of a character. Later on, he would be found to have helped one of his clients launder money. He gave me kind of a Saul Goodman vibe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So blacks total less than 2% of the Cape's population. That's more than 4% below the state average and almost 11% below the national average. Potential jurors' names were pulled from voter registration lists, too, then chosen randomly by town clerks. But on the Cape, the poor and the people of color are really not socially integrated, but often seasonal transient workers who are far less likely to register to vote. But the defense attorney George knew there was an even bigger problem than that, because legal scholars and jury specialists have agreed that it's nearly impossible to detect prejudice in a jury pool, because most people are pretty good at hiding their biases. In most states, attorneys are given the right to question prospective jurors during the selection process, known as voir dire. In Massachusetts, it's the judges who ask questions, not the lawyers. So this means that the questions are a compromise between those requested by the defense and those requested by the prosecution. So the race questions caused arguments. Given that the Massachusetts rules of procedure don't allow follow-up questions from the lawyers, it was up to the judge to dig deeper and to ask a follow-up that might reveal hidden bias. The prosecution wanted to ask if the allegation that a black man raped and killed a white woman would make it impossible for the juror to make a fair judgment. But for the defense, that was too obvious a question. George preferred a clearer approach. Do you believe that blacks are more likely to commit crimes than whites? So the defense cited studies proving that such a direct question was more effective, and they did win that argument.
On Wednesday, October 18th, jury selection was completed. There were 2 black people in the 16-person panel.
Well, that's not great.
Well, it's better than the population average.
I suppose, but if I'm going on trial, I wouldn't be real confident about that.
In opening statements, the prosecutor explained that the Commonwealth's case would revolve around McCowen's DNA, found on Christa's breast and in her vagina, and also on the defendant's ability to describe the crime the night he was arrested. And he was supplying details only the killer would know. Shaking his head as though he was nearly overcome by the crime's brutality, he cautioned the jury against viewing the evidence through the prism of race. This case has to do with a horrendous crime, he said, with an individual matching the DNA. The color of his skin has nothing to do with it. He finished his opening statement in 29 minutes.
Well, studies, have shown that almost 70% of murder trial jurors make up their minds immediately after opening statements. Now, when I read that, I have to admit I was pretty shocked.
Yeah, this is one of those tough things. I don't think you can either prove nor disprove this.
That they make up their mind?
Yeah.
Well, no, I think that in this study I'm referring to, they just asked them.
Right.
Right. Okay. So knowing this, defense attorney Robert George spent hours and hours preparing his opening statement. He began by telling the jurors that McCowen was on trial solely because of his race and economic status. He said the evidence said so. The arrest, he said, was based on a false assumption that a Vassar-educated 46-year-old, world-traveling wealthy heiress could not possibly have had consensual sex with a black, uneducated, troubled garbage man. The defense's argument was that McCowen had had consensual sex with Christa on the Thursday night before she was killed, and that was the explanation for his DNA being found. For 39 months, police said they were searching for Christa's last lover, but when they arrested McCowen, then the lover became a sexual predator. Police hadn't looked for a rapist before, he repeated, because you will hear from the doctors that there was no evidence of rape. McCowen had never been a suspect, and during his 2 interviews with police, he did the only smart thing he has done in this whole case and told them he didn't know her. And he was right, because when he did admit that he knew her, he got indicted for murder. The Commonwealth's case is non-existent, George told the jury. There were no fingerprints, no forensic evidence of any kind, and no witness to tie the defendant to the crime. So, although I do see some of his points, and I do believe that they changed it from being a former lover to being a predator, based a lot on who he was as a person.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I also wouldn't say there was no evidence. Plenty of times there is rape and there's no evidence of it being forceful.
Right.
So you could go either way with that, although it was a very dramatic opening statement. Tim Arnold, age 48, was the prosecution's first witness. So he wore a preppy blue blazer, a tie, and gray flannel trousers. His graying hair was worn in a ponytail. So he did move unsteadily, walking sideways, kind of like a crab. Jurors knew he'd been Christa's lover and that he had found her body, but what they didn't know was that he'd recently had brain surgery. So maybe he'd been in better shape when she died than he was when he came into the courtroom. I think that's the point there. He described the day that he'd found Christa's body, and he also testified that Christa usually kept her cell phone in her escort's glove compartment and that she used reading glasses. These were both significant pieces of evidence because the glasses and the car keys were found on the ground outside, and the phone was found on the kitchen table. He added that Christa would sometimes meet people she wasn't really familiar with outside of her house. So if she saw someone coming up the drive, he explained she would go outside to talk to them and not just let them in her house. So the defense attorney knew that Tim Arnold's affection for Ava and his physical difficulties would make him sympathetic to the jury. He really needed to walk a fine line. If he was too tough, he'd sway the jurors' sympathy toward the witness. If he was too lenient, he'd lose an advantage that might actually help his client. So he led Tim Arnold back to when the police spoke to him outside of the house after the arrival of the paramedics, when he told them he believed Christa had fallen. Familiar as he was with the house, he must have known that that was impossible. The stairs were around the corner from the hallway where the body was found. But Tim Arnold shook his head, denying that he'd said she might have fallen. He said that Jan Worthington said that, not him.
Arnold admitted he told the police that he and Christa used to fight all the time, and that she could be cruel and abusive. He also admitted that his third interview with detectives had become confrontational. Before that, he'd already hired an attorney. Arnold testified that the phone in the study was the only landline in the house. When George pressed him, Arnold admitted that he had left messages on her machine when he'd been upset. We've heard those,
yes.
A few of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Arnold testified that his attorney wasn't present when police came to talk to him in January of 2003. But before that fourth interview, he had contacted police on his own to tell them about fingerprints that he may have left on Christa's bedroom window. He told the police he'd gone for a run and that it was his custom to stop at Christa's house and say hi in the morning after his run. So you have to wonder, did Christa really want him to stop by and say hi?
Right.
Right? But on this one occasion, she was in bed taking a nap with Ava. So he had come to her house and knocked on the door. She didn't answer, and he said he was concerned because she wasn't responding. So he went around to look in the window to make sure she was okay and sleeping with her child. Now, I think that's really kind of stepping over the line to go peek in the bedroom window. Arnold did admit that Christa had looked up from her nap and had seen him. He couldn't remember whether she was dressed or not, but he did recall that she was annoyed. The defense attorney's subsequent questions were answered with, "I don't remember, probably, or not really." And it was brought out that he was on antidepressants and in counseling at the time, and he did admit that was partly because of anger management issues with Christa. On 3 separate occasions, he'd admitted that the relationship was troubled, that they'd argued all the time, and now he reluctantly acknowledged that he'd often have to leave the house just to cool off after their arguments. It seems she really didn't treat him very well, and he had a lot of pent-up anger.
Yes, he did. The defense raised questions about how accurate the police timeline was. George thought that the time of death in the case was completely off. If the time of death in this case is off the mark, he said, then McCowen doesn't need an alibi because he would be somewhere else at the time of the crime being committed, simply by the way the evidence is going to come in. Now, the medical examiner who did Christa's autopsy was ill and unable to testify, so another pathologist stood in. The defense pressed the pathologist who subbed in to review the autopsy report about exactly when rigor mortis set in and what that said about Christa's time of death, arguing that because she hadn't been in full rigor, she couldn't have died earlier than 8 a.m. on Saturday, January 5th. Much of this forensic back and forth over the phases of rigor mortis, avidity, effects of temperature, and so on was very complicated.
Yeah, and to add more doubt about the timeline, the defense presented a new scenario at trial, one they believed was mostly ignored during the police investigation. Gerard Smith, a Truro resident, was called to the stand, and Smith said that back in 2002 he would regularly go for walks in Christa's neighborhood. He said that on Saturday, January 5th, around 12 noon, one day before Christa's body was found, he was walking down Depot Road when something caught his attention. "I could hear a car going at a very fast rate of speed because of the sand that it kicked up under the car," he testified. I turned to see who was driving that car at such a fast rate, and the car came out of a driveway, took a right turn, and didn't stop. He said the driveway was Christa Worthington's. Smith testified that this happened around 1 p.m. He said he was standing about 15 feet from a dark-colored car that bolted out of Christa's driveway and sped off. I think that the vehicle was large and it was dark, but I didn't pay that much attention to it. I just kept looking at the person, he said. And that person, he said, did not look like Chris McCowen. Smith testified that the driver of the car he saw was a man, Caucasian, a little dark, but not black. And Smith said that this person had an oval face and brown hair. The information in the police report of Smith's statements is consistent with what Smith testified to in court, though the prosecutor had written that Smith said it was closer to 2 p.m. when he saw the vehicle. Smith said the police later showed him photos of cars, but he insisted that they should have been showing him photos of potential drivers. They kept saying, well, what did the car look like? And I kept saying, I didn't look at the car, I looked at the person driving it, Smith said. They had their own way and that was it. I guess they just didn't believe me or something like that. So, if that's true, I think that's probably the strongest piece of evidence for the defense, really.
Yeah, well, it helps the defense, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, there's not much else here that does help the defense. No. McCowen's attorney said investigators disregarded Smith's testimony because he wasn't telling them something they wanted to hear. If Smith's story was to be believed, then the scenario was troubling. In addition to his challenges with the state's timeline, the defense also focused on the autopsy report, narrowing in on the fact that despite all the injuries Christa had suffered, the autopsy report did not specify that there had been a sexual assault. There is no evidence of any violent sexual contact with the victim in this case, in the form of injury, is there? Defense attorney George asked the pathologist on the stand. There is no report of injury, right? That's correct, the pathologist responded. The medical examiner's report does not mention that Christa was raped, and there's nothing to suggest that her body was violently sexually assaulted, said a former FBI profiler. So, in challenging the prosecution's argument that a sexual assault had occurred, the defense proposed a new scenario to the jury. McCowen had never been in Christa's house overnight, Friday into Saturday, as the police report of his interview says. But instead, McCowen had gotten his days mixed up, and he was there at her house on Thursday, and that's when he had sex with her. So then we have the whole Christmas tree story that does support the Thursday, if you want to tell us about that.
So McCowen's trash route were taken by Christa's house on Thursdays. The defense said it was on Thursday before she was found dead that she invited McCowen into her house to look at her Christmas tree, and that's when they had sex. To back this up, they were able to point out a call that was placed by McCowen from inside Christa's house that Thursday. Don Horton, who was McCowen's boss at Cape Cod Disposal, said he got a call from McCowen one day while McCowen was on his route, and said McCowen told him he was at Christa's house and wanted to know about how to dispose of her Christmas tree. Horton said he couldn't be sure of the day, but it was one of Christa's regular pickup days. Those were Thursdays. McCowen called me, and he asked, "She has a Christmas tree. What should I do? Should I take it?" Horton said. Chris was in the wrong truck because I had little rubbish trucks, and I told him, "We will get it on Monday when we go into Provincetown to do the recycling. We'll just stop there on the way back if she wants us to pick it up then."
So in addition to McCowen's claim that he was at Christa's house on Thursday, and Horton backed up that statement, the defense also pointed out that McCowen's fingerprints were never found at the crime scene, and while investigators found hairs, they never found any that were consistent with belonging to an African American. The only DNA evidence tying McCowen to the scene was the DNA found on Christa's body, but the semen sample police collected was so degraded that it could have been there for days before her death. So I'd like to know more about that, but I haven't been able to find out any more. But that's interesting to me. I'd like to read about if DNA degrades over time and how you judge the length of that.
Yeah,
So,
that would be important.
yeah, that would be interesting. So anyway, there were no fingerprints, there were no footprints, there was nothing in the house that indicated Chris McCowen was there, except, of course, the seminal fluid, which is a biggie.
And so whether you put him there Thursday or Friday, it's a wash. There's no evidence either way to nail down what day he was there.
No, but we know she wasn't killed on Thursday.
Right.
Right. So if he was only there on Thursday, he's not the killer. If he wasn't there on Friday, but he was there on Thursday, then he didn't kill her.
Well, okay. I guess you could say that.
Yeah, you could.
But you can't differentiate whether he'd been there Thursday or Friday. When did he deposit his sample of semen?
Well, that you can't tell for sure. That's why I'd like to know more about the degrading process of samples. But we do know from the phone call that he was there on Thursday, so I think the guy seeing the car pull out of her driveway and the Christmas tree story are really the strongest defenses of McCowen. Whether you think they're really strong or not, I think it's the best stuff they've got for the defense. So the whole point of that story is that someone else was there at her house and sped away. So that's just an alternate suspect that could have killed her.
Right.
Right. So also as part of his defense, McCowen's attorney also offered alternative theories of who may have committed the murder, and this included Jeremy Fraser, the man who McCowen blamed for the murder in a statement to police, and who ended up testifying on behalf of the prosecution at McCowen's trial. So Fraser testified he was at the juice bar with his friends Sean Mulvey and Chris McCowen for that rap contest on the Friday before Christa's body was found. Just like in his interview with the police, Fraser said they left the bar and went to a party where a fight broke out and everyone was kicked out. Fraser said he and Mulvey then went to Mulvey's father's house and were there the rest of the night. And Fraser said he didn't know what happened to McCowen. But then, under cross, Fraser made a shocking admission that he didn't remember where he had gone after leaving the juice bar. And this is what he said, until they fed me pieces of information about where I was that night. So that does not sound good. When asked about who'd been feeding him pieces of information, Fraser said the state police. Fraser said under oath that the police helped refresh his memory about where he was that night. But then he denied ever going to Christa's house or having anything to do with her death. So Mulvey testified that Fraser was probably the most intoxicated of the three of them. Police said McCowen went over to Christa's house by himself, but McCowen's attorney questioned Mulvey at the trial about his story, asking if he was so sure Fraser was with him all night, why didn't he initially back up Fraser's alibi when police first talked to him? So Mulvey had initially told police he didn't remember anything from that night. Mulvey said he had told police that because he'd been acting on his father's advice not to get involved. But 16 days after the start of the trial, the jury was given the case for deliberation. The jury deliberated for 8 days, and one juror was dismissed over phone calls she'd made to her boyfriend where she'd talked about the case before the verdict came in. On November 16, 2006, Chris McCowen was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, rape, and aggravated burglary. McCowen never testified at his trial, but at his sentencing, the court heard from him for the first time when he read a statement. McCowen said in his statement that he felt sorry for the Worthington family for what had happened to Christa and her daughter, but all this time I've been innocent, he said. McCowen was given 3 life sentences, one for each of the charges he was convicted on without the possibility of parole. And just a day after McCowen's guilty verdict, his defense attorney got a call from one of the jurors, and this juror had concerns about the deliberation process. Over the next few days, 2 or more jurors also came forward with similar complaints. So these jurors believed that there was racial bias in the jury deliberations, and the defense immediately filed a motion to set aside the verdict because of racial bias in the jury room. The 3 jurors signed affidavits which included allegations that racist comments were made during deliberations, and that some jurors had already made up their minds on McCowen's guilt before deliberations even began. One of the jurors who signed the affidavit was the only black female. Author and consultant Peter Manso recorded an interview with that juror for his 2011 book, Reasonable Doubt. I would say the first day, as soon as we got in there, the first thing I say, just to see how everybody's thinking, my words to them were, "So guys, let's just see where we stand here. Who all thinks this man is guilty?" And so I get some hands raised, probably 5, 6, and then I said, now who thinks not guilty? And there were probably like 2. The juror said a couple of people didn't raise their hands at all, but she said she told them, we haven't even begun to deliberate, and you people already think this man is guilty. Now, is it really wrong to make up your mind before you deliberate? Because you've seen the whole trial. As long as you're open to deliberating, I think you can hold that opinion.
You can?
Yeah.
And plus, she asked for the votes.
Yes.
It's not like these are people volunteering guilt or innocence. She
No.
said, let's just see where we stand here.
Right.
She takes a poll.
But it does get worse because at one point the juror said that another female juror stood up and screamed at the top of her lungs, yes, if this big black man beat this lady the way they said, she would have these same marks. So that wasn't good. Other jurors said race didn't play a role in their decision, but McCowen's differing accounts of what happened and the DNA match were crucial. So I understand that. The DNA put Christopher McCowen at the crime scene, one juror said. It put an approximate time he was there at the crime scene, and there's no altering that. I'm not so sure about the time he was at the crime scene either, though. So to sort whether racial bias played a role in the jury's verdict, Superior Court Judge Gary Nickerson, the same judge who oversaw the trial, held a post-trial hearing to look back at how the jury had reached their verdict. Each of the jurors were called in to testify about their deliberation process. It took about 4 or 5 days of hearings to get through every juror, and then a couple of months later, in early 2007, Judge Nickerson announced his decision that no racial bias had been found. The defense motion to throw out the verdict was denied, and an appeal was filed on multiple issues that, too, was denied.
Now, with a new defense attorney, McCowen is hoping to get new evidence that could warrant a new trial and overturn his conviction. There were a number of items that were not tested. One of them was fibers, said McCowen's current defense attorney, Gary Pelletier. These items need to be tested. So there are 2 distinct sides to this murder case. To some, Chris McCowen is a laid-back man. To others, he's a violent man who raped and killed Christa Worthington and left her toddler daughter alone with her mother's dead body. The defense and author Peter Menzo see this case as an example of assumptions and prejudice leading to a false conviction. The defense has pointed out that the prosecution's case was built around a belief that this educated white woman could not possibly have had consensual sex with a good-looking but simple black garbage collector. One thing they point out is that the case was seen only as a murder case for 3 years. But once they had the DNA of a black man, the case morphed into aggravated rape and murder. The only way to get an acquittal would have been for the defense to convince a jury that the sex had been consensual. Yeah,
so I do think the fact that he was black played a role in them having a hard time believing it was consensual. Not only that he was black, but that he was, from a different socioeconomic background. But on the other hand, the DNA is really hard to overlook, especially with no proof or witnesses that there was any kind of relationship at all. So if he'd been dating her or something, it would be easier to believe. So the prosecution maintains that the DNA in interviews with Chris were overwhelming evidence of his guilt and that his race doesn't matter. DNA was the deciding factor, but did it really connect McCowen to the murder? Experts testified that McCowen's semen had likely been deposited before the time prosecutors said the crime occurred. And again, I don't know where they came up with that or how. So that's something I'd like to look into more.
Well, before the crime occurred, how before?
Right. That's what I want to know. The day before? Does this have to do with this sample degrading over a day or two, or are they just saying like a couple hours before?
Well, and also, what about the sample on her breast?
That was a saliva sample.
Was that tested? Did we get any results from that?
Yeah, that was his DNA. It was McCowen's saliva DNA. Yeah, so it's really hard to get past the DNA. I will give you that. So, McCowen himself didn't testify, and the court refused to allow defense witness Dr. Eric Brown to address McCowen's Thursday afternoon sexual encounter with Christa. The defendant's account is offered in the book Reasonable Doubt from Dr. Brown's notes of October 10th, 16th, and 27th in 2016. So, from Dr. Brown's notes of October 10th, 16th, and 27th in 2006. So, Dr. Brown basically said, and this is only part of his notes, Mr. McCowen said that he happened to notice some extra trash on the back porch and went over to pick it up. As he was gathering up this trash, Miss Worthington reportedly opened the door and asked, "Can you take a Christmas tree?" Mr. McCowen answered, "It depends on how big it is." So at this point, Mrs. Worthington reportedly said, "Come in and take a look." Mr. McCowen then reported, "I walked into the back door and followed her through the kitchen to the living room. I looked at the tree. It wasn't too big. I said I'd call my boss and then went back out to the truck. I told the boss it was a medium tree and they said it was okay. I walked back in and took a closer look at the trunk. Then I stood back and asked her when she was going to take the lights and ornaments, and she said a couple of days to a week. So I told her, just let me know when I can get it." Allegedly, Miss Worthington touched him and rubbed lightly against his arm with her arm while he was looking at the tree. As Mr. McCowen turned toward Miss Worthington and looked down at her, she looked up at him, and they allegedly kissed. It was immediately apparent to Mr. McCowen that both he and Miss Worthington were sexually aroused, and after kissing, they each quickly undressed and became sexually engaged with one another in vaginal intercourse. McCowen told Brown the sexual encounter lasted for approximately 45 minutes. So that's generous, giving himself a lot of credit there. But McCowen told Brown that he mentioned the Christmas tree discussion when first interviewed by police in 2002, and for that reason he assumed they knew he'd been inside the Worthington home. He said he'd left out the sex part because Christa had asked him not to tell anyone. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say because he had time to think all this up.
Yes, he did.
He did. So if he'd said that right from the beginning, if there'd been some kind of witness, I think that would have helped him. But the doctor went on to say Mr. McCowen insisted that the police would not accept his account of having consensual sex on Thursday with Ms. Worthington, but repeatedly told him that they did not believe his story. And little by little he gave in and modified his statements to appease the police, who he thought were treating him as a witness and not as a murderer. Here and elsewhere during his long interrogation, the police induced Mr. McCowen to make hypothetical statements that they later manipulated him into acknowledging as behavior that he actually did. So the prosecutors expressed disbelief of the consensual sex scenario, but they had Christa's diary. Why didn't they use it? If they had, they would have realized that Christa might well have enjoyed secret sex with a black man, even a black garbage collector. So that's basically why they were talking about her being kind of promiscuous, I guess. Willing to have sex with different people kind of randomly, comparing it even to her grandmother, who sought out some different types of partners. So in my opinion, many things about this case point to McCowen's guilt, but I think there is some racial and even socioeconomic bias that can't be completely ignored. If he was a college-educated white man, would the DNA and interview result in an indictment and a conviction? It is possible, but I do think it was more likely because of his race and position in society.
Well, I think the bottom line is that it's his DNA.
Yes.
In her vagina.
Right.
And his saliva on her breast.
Sure. No
one else's.
That's true.
And he's given conflicting statements to the police. I would find it difficult to believe that someone else did it. I mean, his story is that, yeah, my DNA's there because we had consensual sex the day before.
Right, but he never said that earlier is the problem.
Right.
And no one knew of that.
Well, and even when he said it, it just doesn't sound like it really occurred.
Yeah, so I don't know what case we were talking about the other day, what we were talking about. What's the difference between being innocent or being falsely convicted? So with Christopher McCowen, I feel like he's probably not innocent, but maybe he was falsely convicted. Maybe he does deserve a new trial at least. Of course, he hasn't gotten one.
Yeah, and it's been 15 years.
It's been a while, yeah, and more than that. And there are many aspects of this case which we didn't have time to delve into completely, like how phone records were obtained and why interviews weren't recorded. So if you're interested in this case and want to find out more, I highly recommend Peter Manzo's book, Reasonable Doubt. So you can get all the details, very detailed book. He goes over the trial point by point from jury selection to verdict. So it really is a fascinating read. Something I'm recommending for sure. Because I think this is just a fascinating case in that it's not cut and dry at all. There really is a lot of gray here.
Well, your question of whether the same sentence would have been handed down to a white, educated male.
Yeah.
Yes, it would have been.
You think so?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I think it was like a college professor that said we had consensual sex on Thursday. I think he might have been believed more than this guy was.
Okay.
Could have happened.
I would say that if your DNA is there and you have trouble giving a good, complete story, you're guilty.
Yeah, the story's not great. I'll give you that. Okay, so we could talk about this for hours. I'm going to move on.
Oh, we could.
Okay, so now it's time for my bi-weekly reminders, and then we'll move on to feedback. We do have a premium option of the show, which gives you early ad-free and bonus shows. It's kind of less formal than a normal episode, lots of fun to do, and many of our listeners enjoy listening to them. So if this interests you, we appreciate your support, and we'll work hard to give you entertaining bonus shows. And we would tell you to go to tiegrabber.com to subscribe. If you prefer, you can also subscribe at patreon.com/tiegrabber and get the same benefits. Some other ways to support the show, as always, we would love to get a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen to us. Or we would enjoy getting an email or a voicemail with your feedback and case suggestions. Also, if you have any friends who are into true crime and you think they might enjoy listening to us, we'd really appreciate you letting them know about us. If you do have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, please send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. And as always, voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. So thank you all for spending your time with us at the Quiet End, and let's do a little feedback.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, I have a couple emails for you. The first one's from Taylor C., and it's probably going to take a few minutes to discuss that. So that's why there's only 2.
Just 2 today. Okay. So this is an email from Taylor C., and she writes, Idaho Innocence Project client Christopher Tapp, 47, died on November 5th in Las Vegas after an accidental fall on October 29th caused irreversible head injuries. Mr. Tapp was rushed to a hospital, where after a week of efforts to save him, he died. He is survived by his mother Vera, who stood by her son from the moment he was falsely charged 27 years ago until his untimely death. Vera actually took out a second mortgage to pay for several unsuccessful appeals and worked a second job well past retirement age just to ensure there were funds in Mr. Tapp's commissary for the 21 years he was incarcerated. So Christopher Tapp was officially exonerated in 2019, the first person in the world to be proven innocent with genetic genealogy. He was just a teen when Angie Dodge was murdered in 1996. And unable to solve the case and acting off an unfounded hunch, police preyed on him in their effort to close the case. So they interrogated Mr. Tapp abusively for 60 hours over 2 weeks, manipulating him using fake polygraphs and threatening him with the death penalty. Although it was obvious that Angie Dodge was attacked and killed by a single assailant and the DNA excluded Mr. Tapp from the beginning, the police put together new and different theories to make Mr. Tapp an accomplice to the unidentified man who'd left his DNA all over the crime scene. In the end, none of the science nor physical evidence mattered to the police. All they cared about was closing a murder case that had gone unsolved for more than 7 months. Mr. Tapp's prosecution and conviction relied almost exclusively on the fabricated and false confession. Many in the community knew that Christopher Tapp was innocent. Even the victim's mother, Carol Dodge, ultimately came to believe the confessions were coerced and invented by the police. For years, she joined in advocating for Mr. Tapp's release and for additional investigation to identify the actual assailant.
We did an episode on this case in November of 2020.
This is a case I remember very well. It had a real effect watching those interrogations.
Definitely. So Angie Dodge was murdered in 1996. She was 18 years old and was living by herself in a small apartment. Now, 3 friends had visited her the night before, and her body was found the next day in her bedroom. Chris Tapp became a suspect 6 months later, and after many hours of interrogation, he confessed to the murder. So, despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the fact that it was another man's DNA on Angie's body, Tapp was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to life in May 1998.
Yeah, so that's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's really crazy.
Well, in hindsight, it was.
Yeah, it really was.
Tapp recanted his confession in 2001, saying that he'd been coerced by police into confessing. In 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project took on Tapp's case. His case was appealed in 2017, and the rape charge was rescinded. So this reduced the prison sentence from 30 to 20 years, which he had already served, so Tapp was released.
Yeah, but he should have been exonerated at that point.
He should have been.
Yeah, in July of 2019, there was a new suspect named, and he sued the city of Idaho Falls for wrongful conviction in 2020.
Tapp did.
Yeah. And then in 2022, there was a settlement for $11.4 million. So then, he's not very old. What happened? Why did he die?
Well, he was killed in an altercation that had happened in Las Vegas. Daniel Rodimer has been charged in Tapp's death, and he's awaiting trial. The story is that they were at some function or party or something, and Rodimer was convinced that Tapp was trying to get Rodimer's daughter or stepdaughter to try some cocaine. And they had a fight, and Tapp got head injuries that led to his death.
Well, that's very sad.
Now, in 2014, investigators began using DNA to identify Angie's murderer. Initially, they looked at Y chromosome analysis. Remember, the Y chromosome is only what us guys have.
Right, yeah.
So you're looking at male or paternal lineage. And this analysis identified a Michael Usry as a suspect. But when you did a full DNA analysis, he didn't match the DNA found at the scene. Then in 2018, again using DNA, but this time the DNA testing was autosomal DNA, which is just, looking at the 23 pairs of chromosomes. And they found Brian Lee Dripps Sr. And when they tested his DNA, they got a perfect match from the DNA found at the scene. And confronted with this information, Dripps confessed to the rape and murder of Angie, and he was convicted in 2021.
Huh. So how did he know Angie? Did he live in the area or something?
He lived in the area. I don't think he knew her, but he knew who she was.
Well, I think I remember from Dateline or whatever we watched on this, how her apartment was kind of set up and she was being watched by this guy.
He could see into her window from his window.
Really tragic case, yeah. Okay.
So the question that came from this, the question that Taylor posed, how public are those DNA repositories?
Uh-huh.
If Ancestry.com or whatever it is, or 23andMe, is this information that's available to the public, or is there some privacy?
That I don't know. I know that if you go on there and do your DNA, you can find out who's related to you, right? But I'm not sure otherwise. So that's an interesting thing to look into. I'm going to say that's a project for Dickie. Well, did you already do it?
A little bit.
Okay.
What's probably going to happen is that sites are going to have to say that your DNA might be given to authorities. It's not private.
Oh, okay. So something you have to sign to give permission or something?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, we have one more case suggestion. This is getting long, so let's do this one. This is a case suggestion from Mandy D. And Mandy writes, I'd like to suggest a case. It's the murder of Jessica Evans and Jacob Wheeler. This happened in a small Illinois town about 40 minutes away from me. It's such a heartbreaking and tragic story. I think you'd do a great job covering it. Thank you. I haven't seen it on any other podcast, Mandy says.
What's the story on this?
So Jessica Evans, 17-year-old high school senior from Norris City, Illinois, and she met 22-year-old Jacob Wheeler, and those two became a couple. And by all accounts, they seemed happy with each other. They went on a fishing trip along the Wabash River in Centerville, Illinois, and on the evening of August 26, 2012, Jessica's mother called the police because they didn't return from their trip, and then Jessica didn't show up for work that day. So sadly, Jessica's body was found on August 27th on the bed of Jacob's pickup truck on an abandoned farm less than 2 miles from where they were camping. Additional information led to Jacob's body being found less than a week later, and he was found in a remote wooded area about 10 miles from the campsite. Both had been shot in the head, Jessica actually was shot 3 times, and she was sexually assaulted as well, which we're looking at the sexual assault as the likely motive here. Before Jacob was found, he'd been considered a person of interest in Jessica's murder, but that of course changed when he too was found dead. The investigators did catch a break in the case when they found some broken car parts at the site where Jessica and Jacob had camped, and these parts led the police to Danny Costin, who was 36 years old at the time. Now, he lived close to Jacob's father's home and had known him, but didn't know the couple. And I think this case has been recommended to us before. Years ago. I can't remember from who. But detectives did bring Danny Costin in for questioning. They took his truck for forensic examination, and Danny told the police different stories about what he did during the early hours of August 26th. When forensic technicians found human blood in his truck, he was confronted and interviewed, and it turns out that Danny had been drinking at a local bar. When he got home, he took his truck and drove down to the river, and that's where he ran into Jessica and Jacob. So we think this was a crime of opportunity. He went home to get his boat so that he could go fishing, but his boat got stuck not too far from where the couple was, and Jacob refused when Danny asked for help, but did offer to drop him at home. So, unfortunately, the 3 all set out in Jacob's pickup truck. So Danny then killed Jacob, sexually assaulted Jessica, and killed Jessica. So it just seems like a crime of opportunity where he decided he wanted to rape this woman and killed both of them for that reason.
Well, it might have been also, too, that he was pissed off that Jacob wouldn't help him.
I guess, but that's a bit of an overreaction.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, it could have been a combination. Maybe he got pissed off.
It looks interesting.
Yeah. Interesting case. Like I said, it has been recommended before, so we might end up covering that one in a future episode.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We appreciate it very much, and we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Come on down. Plenty of room.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.